Hello, students. We are continuing forward with a little bit of grammar instruction, and today we are looking at independent and dependent clauses. Let's take a look at our learning objective. After learning about independent and dependent clauses and seeing how they are used in text examples, students will practice writing complex sentences correctly. Let's go through our tabs and then we'll do a little review at the end. So the vocabulary is not a drag and drop activity, it's just a chart for you to read, but let's go ahead and go through this. So a dependent clause is a group of words that has a subject and a predicate but begins with a word that makes it dependent. So if you forget what this stuff means, a subject of a sentence is who or what the sentence is about. And the predicate of a sentence is the action of the sentence, what's happening in the sentence. So a clause, all clauses, whether they're dependent or independent, have a subject and a predicate. The difference is that a dependent clause usually begins with a word that makes it dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So here's an example. While I found their leashes, this does not make sense as a complete thought on its own. And the reason for that is because of this word while. If you drop that word out of there and just had I found their leashes, that makes a little bit more sense. But the word while I found their leashes, if I was to come up to you and say, while I found their leashes, and then just stop, you would probably be confused and wonder if maybe I'm glitching in the matrix and do I have something to finish that thought. So that's what makes them dependent clauses. It depends on the rest of the sentence. In this case, the dogs waited while I found their leashes. That makes much more sense now. An independent clause, on the other hand, is same as a dependent. It's a group of words and it has its own subject and predicate, and it can stand alone as a complete thought. So let's look at this example. I took my dog to Washington Park, but we had to leave when it started raining. This is a perfectly fine sentence. And if I was to put a period here after the opening independent clause, it would still make sense. I took my dog to Washington Park, period. That is a perfectly fine sentence on its own. So that is an independent clause. It can stand independently without needing the rest of the sentence to make sense. So I hope that that clarifies the difference between the two. Let's just take a look at a couple of more examples here. So an independent clause is also sometimes called a main clause. Remember that. If you see the word main clause in like a test or something, that means an independent clause. An independent or main clause has a subject and a predicate, and it expresses a complete thought. It can stand alone as a complete sentence. So let's take a look at these examples. I'm going to jump over to the correct list because I think it's easier to understand. The family visited the beach. This has a subject. The subject of the sentence or this clause is the family, and it has something happening. Visited the beach. This qualifies as a independent clause, and it is a complete thought. You could put a period at the end of this and it doesn't feel like it's lacking anything. However, if I had dropped the subject out of the sentence and just had visited the beach, this is no longer a clause because it doesn't satisfy having both a subject and a predicate. We'll reverse that with the next one. The sleepy teen turned off his alarm clock. Here we've got the subject, the sleepy teen, and we have what's happening in it, the predicate, turned off his alarm clock. This qualifies as a clause, and it feels like a complete thought. Put a period at the end, and it makes sense. That is an independent clause or a main clause. If I was to drop the action off of the sentence, the what's happening or the predicate of the sentence, we'd just be left with the subject alone, the sleepy teen, and that does not qualify as a clause. Remember, clauses have to have both a subject and a predicate. All right, let's go down and take a look at some dependent clause examples. So to start that off, a dependent clause is also called a subordinate clause. So keep that in mind. Independent clauses are usually called main clauses, and dependent clauses are often called subordinate clauses. Just remember that. And just like any clause, they contain a subject and a predicate, but it does not express a complete thought. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. Here's an example. This is from the book Night. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that churned my life into one long night times seven times sealed. This last part of the sentence, it is a clause. It has a subject. Believe it or not, the word that is the subject because it's replacing the word night in this case. Churned my life into one long night would be our action of the sentence. So this does qualify as a clause, but because of this word that, it needs to have the rest of this in order for it to make sense. So it is a dependent clause depending on the rest of it to feel complete. And the final example here, this is from the author of Night. He received a Nobel Prize, and this is from his acceptance speech. Do I have the right to represent the multitudes who have perished? Who have perished is a clause. It has a subject, who, and it has the action, have perished. That's your predicate. So this certainly qualifies as a clause, but because of the word who, it requires the rest of this in order for it to feel complete. If I was just to walk up to you and say, who have perished, you would be left wondering who I'm talking about. So this is why it's dependent on the rest of this to be complete. All right, hopefully I didn't confuse you too much with that. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the Your Turn tab, and then we'll finish with a short review. So on the Your Turn tab, you're going to have 3 different pages to do. The first one is a quick drag and drop, just seeing the difference between an independent or main clause and a subordinate or dependent clause. Page 2 is a multiple choice quiz that would be similar to something that you might see in the end of unit tests. And page 3, you're going to be constructing your own complete sentences using the independent clause that they give you, and then beginning your dependent clause portion of it with whatever word they tell you, and making a full long sentence, what we call a complex sentence over here. So let's look at this first example. Let's meet for dinner. That's an independent clause. Now they want you to add a dependent clause to that, beginning with the word after. So here's their example. Let's meet for dinner after practice is over. After practice is over would be a dependent clause. So you'll just write your own examples of that. All right, let's go ahead and review real quick. Make sure that you have the basics down. So important things to remember. What is an independent or main clause? Can it stand alone, or does it have to be part of a sentence? And the answer to that is independent clauses have both a subject and a predicate and can stand alone as a sentence. You can put a period at the end of them and they make perfect sense as a complete thought. Next question, what is a dependent or what we call a subordinate clause? Answer, a dependent or a subordinate clause also has a subject and predicate, but cannot stand alone as a complete statement. It requires more information for it to feel complete. And lastly, how do dependent clauses usually begin? The answer, they usually begin with a subordinating conjunction, such as when, since, because, after, or while. They may also begin with a relative pronoun, such as who, whose, whom, which, that, or what, or with a relative adverb, such as when, where, or why. Look for those types of words to begin your dependent clauses. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, but as always, if you are confused or lost or need to talk this through, please call me over so that I can chat with you.